Police officers burned a man's car in front of him, but they didn't know he was the police sheriff. Kevin Holland was just a man driving his brown Audi on a calm Saturday morning, heading out for a weekend getaway in the countryside. To most onlookers, he seemed like anyone else. No one would guess that the laid-back, middle-aged man in jeans and a flannel shirt was actually Sheriff of Oak Ridge County, a small but close-knit area about 50 miles out of town. Kevin preferred to keep a low profile when he wasn't on duty. Little did he know, his weekend would soon be hijacked by a series of events that would test his patience and ultimately shake up the entire police force. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. As he cruised through the outskirts of the neighboring county, he noticed the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car in his rearview mirror. With a sigh, Kevin pulled over to the side of the road, confident he hadn't been speeding or doing anything to warrant a stop. As the officers approached, Kevin rolled down his window with a polite smile, expecting a quick check and perhaps a friendly conversation. He was wrong. The two officers, neither of whom he recognized, walked over with an aggressive demeanor, their hands resting on their holstered firearms. "License and registration," barked the taller of the two without even glancing at Kevin's face. Kevin handed over his documents calmly. "Sure thing, officers. Is there a problem?" he asked, maintaining his cool. The shorter officer snatched the papers from his hand, looking over them before tossing them aside with a sneer. "Brown Audi? This car's been flagged as stolen." Kevin's eyebrows shot up. "There's been a mistake. This car's mine. I can show you the—" "We don't want to hear it," the taller officer interrupted, his voice cold and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle, now!" Realizing things were taking a strange turn, Kevin complied, stepping out of his car but keeping his calm, despite the growing tension. He didn't reveal who he was just yet, figuring this was a mix-up that could be resolved quickly. The officers, however, had a different plan. The shorter cop began rifling through the car without permission, while the taller one started making snide comments. "Nice ride for a stolen vehicle. Too bad you won't be driving it again." Kevin frowned. "Officers, I think if you run the plates again, you'll see—" Before he could finish, the shorter officer stepped back from the car with a look of mock surprise. "What do we have here?" he exclaimed, holding up a small plastic bag filled with white powder. "Looks like someone's got more than a stolen car. You're under arrest." Kevin's heart raced. He hadn't placed that bag there. This was clearly a setup. But before he could protest, the taller officer grinned and turned to his partner. "You know what we do with thieves and drug runners around here. We send a message." Before Kevin could even react, the shorter officer produced a lighter from his pocket. Without warning, he flicked it on, igniting a rag that had been stuffed into the gas tank. Within seconds, flames began to lick at the side of the brown Audi, climbing faster than Kevin could process. "Whoa, whoa! What the hell are you doing?" Kevin shouted, stepping forward, but he was shoved back by the taller cop. "Stay back. Don't want you getting burned," the officer sneered, as both men stood back and watched the flames roar higher. Kevin could feel the heat on his skin, his beloved car being reduced to a pile of burning wreckage in front of his eyes. But as his blood boiled, Kevin's sense of authority returned. "Enough," he said, his voice dropping low, filled with the quiet fury of a man who held real power. "You don't know who you're messing with." The officers laughed. "Oh yeah? And who might you be, Mr. Brown Audi?" Kevin reached into his back pocket, pulling out his badge, which gleamed under the sunlight. "Sheriff Kevin Holland, Oak Ridge County." The laughter died instantly. The shorter officer's face went pale as he stammered, "You're the sheriff?" Kevin nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the two officers. "That's right. And I'll make sure this little stunt goes straight to internal affairs. Arson, false accusations, evidence planting. You've just made the biggest mistake of your careers." The weight of the situation began to sink in for the officers, their bravado crumbling into panic. The taller officer stuttered, We didn't know, sir. We thought—" "You didn't think at all," Kevin snapped, his voice sharp and authoritative. "You saw a man, a car, and you made assumptions. And now, you're going to pay for it." The fire continued to blaze behind them as Kevin calmly called for backup, explaining the situation in a controlled tone. Within minutes, squad cars from the local precinct arrived, along with the fire department. The two officers were swiftly taken into custody, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. As Kevin stood by, watching the fire department extinguish what remained of his Audi, the gravity of the event settled in. His beloved car was gone, but something far more important had been saved. The lesson that no one, not even those in uniform, should be above the law. By Monday morning, news of the incident had spread like wildfire through the department and beyond. The two rogue officers were suspended and soon to face charges. Kevin, though shaken, was resolute. In the end, it wasn't just about his car. It was about making sure justice prevailed, even when it came to his own colleagues. Kevin stood at the wreckage of his Audi, the scent of burnt rubber and charred metal still heavy in the air. The flames had long been extinguished, but the fire within him still raged. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the scene, Kevin couldn't help but reflect on how easily things could have gone unnoticed if he hadn't been who he was. The wrong man at the wrong time, powerless against crooked cops. He clenched his jaw, resolving that this wouldn't just be about his car, this was about exposing a much deeper problem. The local news channels were quick to pick up the story. Within hours, footage of Kevin standing next to his burned-out Audi, giving a brief but firm statement to the press, circulated online. The officers involved had already been suspended pending an investigation, but the sheriff knew this wasn't enough. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a culture that needed reform. By Monday, Kevin found himself sitting at his desk in Oak Ridge County's sheriff department, sorting through stacks of reports and witness statements. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that these kinds of events weren't isolated. If this happened to him, how many others had been falsely accused, harassed, or worse, without ever having a chance to fight back? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was his longtime friend and deputy, Sarah Logan. "You're all over the news," she said, walking in with a coffee in hand. "Everyone's talking about what went down." Kevin sighed, rubbing his temples. Not exactly the kind of publicity I was hoping for. But maybe this is what it takes to get people to open their eyes. Sarah sat across from him, her expression serious. "The two officers. They've got a history. There's been multiple complaints against them for misconduct, but they've always managed to slip through the cracks. Until now." Kevin sat up straighter. "Why wasn't I informed about this?" Sarah shrugged, her frustration evident. "It never got to our department. Their precinct always swept it under the rug. It's the same pattern: intimidation, excessive force, sometimes even planting evidence. Just like with you. They've always targeted people they think won't fight back." Kevin's fists tightened. "Well, they targeted the wrong person this time. I'm going to make sure they never get the chance to abuse their power again." As the days went on, Kevin spearheaded an internal investigation, working closely with the district attorney to build a rock-solid case against the officers. But as more evidence came to light, it became clear that this went beyond just two rogue cops. The corruption ran deeper, snaking through the entire precinct. Several officers had been covering for each other, filing false reports and intimidating witnesses to avoid consequences. One afternoon, Kevin sat in his office going over new reports when his phone buzzed. It was a call from the mayor. "Sheriff Holland, I've been following the situation closely," the mayor began, his voice measured. "This investigation is stirring up a lot of attention and not all of it's good. There are some people who think you're going too far, that this could damage the reputation of law enforcement." Kevin leaned back in his chair, his tone steady. "With all due respect, Mayor, if exposing corruption damages our reputation, then maybe it's our reputation that needs fixing." There was a pause on the other end before the mayor spoke again, softer this time. "I trust your judgment, Sheriff. Just be prepared for some pushback. People in power don't like to be exposed." Kevin hung up, knowing full well what was coming next. But he wasn't about to back down. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that true justice wasn't about protecting the image of the department. It was about protecting the people, even from those who wore the badge. A week later, Kevin received a visitor at his office, James Foster, the former sheriff of the neighboring county where the two rogue officers worked. Foster had retired years earlier, but had kept close ties to the precinct. His reputation was well known, tough, old school, and not one to take kindly to outsiders shaking things up. "Sheriff Holland," Foster greeted, his voice gruff. "Mind if I have a word?" Kevin gestured to a chair. "Go ahead." Foster didn't sit. Instead, he stood by the door, arms crossed, his eyes hard. "I've been hearing about what you're doing, digging into my old precinct. You think you're some kind of hero, burning everything down to make a point?" Kevin met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not burning anything down, Foster. I'm cleaning it up." Foster's jaw tightened. "Those boys you're after, they've been on the force for years. They've made mistakes, sure, but we handle our own. You don't need to drag this out in public, making us all look bad." Kevin stood, his presence commanding. "This isn't about looking bad. It's about doing what's right. If we don't hold each other accountable, then who will?" Foster stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking again, his voice low. "You keep going down this road, and you'll make enemies. Powerful ones. Don't expect anyone to back you up when things get tough." Kevin stepped forward, his voice resolute. "I've spent my whole career fighting for what's right. I'm not about to stop now. If that means making enemies, so be it." Foster left without another word, but Kevin knew that wouldn't be the end of it. The investigation would uncover more than just a few bad cops. It would reveal a culture of silence and complicity, and not everyone would be happy about it. As the weeks went by, more officers were suspended, and the community began to rally behind Kevin. People who had been afraid to speak up for years started coming forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse. It was clear that the corruption ran deeper than anyone had realized. But Kevin wasn't deterred. He'd lost a car, sure, but he'd gained something far more valuable, the chance to bring real change, and he wasn't about to let anyone stand in his way. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.